Yeah, guys, refuel on coffee if you like. We got plenty of very strong coffee. We're actually not only brewing fresh coffee, but we're actually freshly roasting coffee. Coffee that I just brought back from Guatemala for gratuitous. So check it out, it's kind of funny. You could buy a bag of freshly roasted coffee, which actually is interesting because that's kind of the conversation we always have, right? Monero's use cases, and primarily it's used, for ransomware hackers on dark markets. That's where it's used. And whether or not you ethically agree with those things, it shows a use case. It shows that it's evidence that it's functioning as digital cash. So you could even ignore what opinion you have of that, but just from a technology standpoint, it means it's working as intended. And it's slowly, seemingly taking over that use case, which means it's performing as the best form of digital cash we currently have. That seems to be the current trend. But the conversation we always have is, well, there's other things you could do with Monero. For example, you could buy coffee, or you could do the gratuitous thing where you could send tips with Monero directly. Think about this. There's no way to have done that but for Monero, right? People could be drinking coffee in Brooklyn, gratuitous coffee, and they could send a 50-cent tip, just like taking 50 cents out of their pocket and dropping it in a tip jar. Didn't go through Venmo, nobody knows it happened, and now it's in the pocket of a Guatemalan farmer. You just put digital cash around the world. Now that's an amazing, amazing use case. But without further ado, Rolf, take it away.
I have a mic. Oh, thanks. So maybe now for a completely different story. Indeed, we're going to talk a little bit about use cases. So maybe also to start off a little bit about my background. So I'm an academic. I work in the Netherlands at one of the technical universities there, and my area of research is where cryptocurrencies and darknet markets intersect. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is work that I've been doing together with some colleagues over in Delft, where I'm based, on the relationship between Monero and the story of Monero becoming the most preferred currency to be used on these dark markets. And I don't know if the person I had this conversation with is in the room right now, but over coffee, we had a conversation about dark markets is not actually a very neutral term, right? So it sort of already gives a certain perspective. So normally what I tend to use is online anonymous markets, but that's sort of like a lot of words to say the same thing. So for today, I'm keeping it to dark market. And before I get started, and I learned that I need to say next slide when I need the next slide, right? Okay, cool. I'm going to say that in a bit. Before I get started, I want to say I tried a new format of structuring my talk. So a fellow professor of mine at Delft invented this do your talk in 10 memes format. I don't know if this is fun, but I'm going to try too. So here's my talk about dark markets and Monero in 10 memes. But before we get started, next slide. No? No, thanks. So this is about the story of Monero becoming dark markets' favorite payment option. And I want to take you down memory lane from Silk Road to the White House. Not the actual White House, but White House Market, which is or was one of the most prominent underground markets where Monero was accepted. I want to talk about how vendors, so the people who are selling items on these markets, are incentivized to use it, are incentivized to opt Monero as their favorite payment option. But why and how buyers, so the people who actually transact with them, are dragging their feet. And the third and last point, you know that these markets have administrators, right? So the people who are running the market. And I want to talk a little bit about how to create trustworthy admins, so people who can be trusted, without an escrow system. So I think everyone here in the room knows what an escrow system is, right? So it's sort of like a notary where you do not pay directly to the person who sells you an item, let's say narcotics, but in this case you transact through the market holds back on the cash, and then after a while that you say, hey, I received my product, only then the vendor gets his money. That's the escrow system. So how do you do that with Monero is a question altogether. So without further ado, here comes my talk in 10 memes. Next slide. So you know Silk Road, right? Silk Road was, I think, the starting point of this underground ecosystem developed by Rolf van Wegberg. And I think what has been happening for a while, was back in 2011, 2010. What he did was not per se new, right? We're talking an underground market system where you could buy all sorts of stuff which you would normally not be buying in a normal legal environment, but in this case you would be buying it online. But that was already out there for quite some time. But what changed were two things. And I think you know this, but just to get everyone on the same page. What changed is he invented or not per se invented, but he used the combination of the Tor network. So the site we're watching now is a hidden service site, right? So it's on it's on Tor, it's on the darknet. That's the first thing. So you can stay anonymous by using the Tor network as an individual using the market. That's one thing. But the most important other thing was, of course, that he used cryptocurrencies for the first time in combination with the Tor network. So in that case, anonymous or pseudonymous payment systems were introduced to this underground economy where sellers and buyers would interact. And this went from a slow start up until the moment that he was making tens of thousands of dollars in transactions a day. And how this works is that the administrator, so in this case Rolf van Wegberg and his team, took a small fee from every transaction that was going on the market. Funny story, by the way, is that a lot of people did not know about Silk Road, that existed, up until the point that the FBI, really proudly, I must say, held a press conference saying, we took down Silk Road, a market where you can buy all sorts of drugs. And then people were like, is there a market where you can buy all sorts of drugs online, on the darknet, with cryptocurrencies? Awesome. And then everything took off. And this is the story I would like to tell you. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is 2011, right? So we go a little bit further in time, and you know that these markets are coming and going, right? These markets are being targeted by law enforcement. And one of the ways in which law enforcement was able to track, trace, but also shut down these markets was the money trail. Most specifically, the cryptocurrency we just have been talking about. And one, of course, of the items or the attributes of these markets is that they were using Bitcoin from the start. And slowly they began to realize that was not per se in their favor. Why? Because yes, of course, you can use bitcoins to transact with a drug dealer online, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you stay anonymous, right? Because you know this, all the transactions stored in the blockchain, and if information is to be attributed to individuals or personally identifiable information, then law enforcement actually has a better follow the money position than they would have when you were transacting with a drug dealer on a street corner and you were paying cash, right? So the police actually were laughing their balls off that everyone there was still using Bitcoin. Next slide, please. So then people were like, oh my God, okay, if this is happening, maybe then, if I'm running a dark market, I may then want to change that payment option, or change that payment system. Maybe pivot from Bitcoin to Monero. But of course there was a problem, which is a lot of people, and this is, you know, a market, so economic principles apply. The majority of the people who are on these markets only know Bitcoin. Yeah? So this is sort of like the problem of scaling your transactions, or scaling scaling the transaction, trying to get as much people involved in this ecosystem. And here, of course, customers are very important, right? So from a customer perspective, you want to have the most or best experience. So these dark markets were trying to, on the one hand, weigh the pseudonymity of Bitcoin against the anonymity of Monero, when it comes to still doing business, right? Because if they would opt for Monero only, that would increase privacy, but on the other hand, might scare away customers. So they went for the middle ground. Next slide, please. Which is, they, problem solved, they just accepted both. Yeah? So that's what they started out first. And because they were accepting both, we could investigate what then happened. Yeah? Or then, who is actually willing to pay Monero and who is not? Who is actually willing to accept Monero and who is not? And how does the admin, so how does the person who is running the site, make sure that people are incentivized to use Monero instead of Bitcoin? Because for the admin, it is also more secure, of course, to use Monero than to use Bitcoin. Next slide, please. So, the vendors on these markets were like, yes, of course, I would love to get paid in Monero. So, please buy everything that I have for sale in Monero, please, friends. But their buyers are like, so I can pay Monero here? Okay, really? What is that exactly? How do I get my Monero? That was not as easy as it was now, or as it is now, right? So the problem is that when investigating what buyers and what vendors are incentivized to do, when you look at the vendors, we figured out that about half of these vendors on these markets were actually willing to accept Monero. Yeah, this was in the time that you could settle between one of the two. So 50% of the vendors were actually willing to accept Monero, which makes sense because they were looking for more anonymity, because the practices they're involved in are not always legal. This is an understatement. One slide back, please. Yeah. So because those practices are not always legal, that means that they were looking for more enhanced features of privacy. So vendors were actually willing to accept Monero, 50% of them, which is a lot because we're talking 2016, 2017, yeah? I'm talking about that time right now. Does anybody have a guess how many percent of buyers were actually willing to pay in Monero? 2% was 5%. Yeah. So the problem is that this is not matched up, right? So it means that the buyers on these markets are dragging their feet simply because, next slide please. Okay, maybe this meme order would have been different. Anyhow, I made this in the plane over here. Anyhow, so these vendors then were indeed waiting for buyers to pay in Monero because they were advertising their products in Monero, but only 1% of vendors were actually offering their products only to be paid in Monero. Why? Because otherwise they would miss out on a lot of customers. So the status quo was not per se changing. Next slide, please. Why one does not simply pay in Monero? And why is that? Well, this is 2015, 2016, 2017 again. There were not a lot of exchanges where you could simply go to and buy Monero. Back then, also the wallet system was not as evolved as it is now, meaning that people who are the customers on these platforms, these are the people who make or break certain changes, right? These are the people who make and change how we are looking at. The customer is at the center of doing business on these markets. And the problem was, back then, that they were not forced, right? They were not forced to pay in Monero. And I guess that you know where this is going, because that is essentially what happened, right? Because these admins and these vendors were sick and tired of getting, shut down by law enforcement, basically because each and everyone could follow the money trail. I also have to add, though, that if a market goes down, within 3 or 4 months, a new market emerges. So the market ecosystem has always been stable around about 10 to 12 markets at the same time. Right? So these market takedowns are a real pain in the ass for the admins, not per se for the customers, right? Because the customers would go to another market and just, buy whatever they want to buy. But for the admins and for the vendors, it's a high-risk environment because, these markets get taken down because people, vendors, are willing to accept Monero, but buyers are not paying. Next slide, please. So the other thing is that for these buyers, the following applies, which is, I don't always pay in Monero, but when I do, it's on the dark market. This was one of the only things that they would use Monero for. Next slide, please. And the problem is that they had alternatives, right? So these people who are buying or looking to buy drugs could do that on dark markets, but also what we see now are devoted Telegram channels, and also I think maybe even Facebook groups, etc., where also vendors of illegal narcotics are advertising their products, and you can just pay with, prepaid debit cards, all sorts of stuff. So there are alternatives there. So instead of trying to compete with getting everything up to the, the nice environment that buyers want, instead of doing that, these dark markets made a decision. We're not going the way of only focusing on these buyers completely, because if we do, that might sort of like demolish the whole business model altogether. So what did they do? Next slide, please. They said, we want Monero everywhere. So not giving people any option, not telling them, please, pay in Monero. They just scrapped please. They said, pay in Monero. Next slide, please. And that transformed into this market, which is one of the first to do that. Who knows this market? Nobody. Interesting. Oh, I have one hand. Okay. If you're afraid to tell me, it's also fine. You can approach me after. This is the White House market. Doesn't exist anymore. It didn't get shut down by law enforcement. They quit, they say, voluntarily. But this was the first market. Yeah, I think it's not really well readable in the back, but it says top right. It says XMR. So it's my Monero balance. This is my screenshot I took myself, by the way. It is very technically advanced. So it's not only that you can only pay with Monero, it's also the case that there's two-factor authentication with a PGP key. So what they did is they stepped up across the board. So it's not only you cannot pay with Bitcoin anymore, it's also you have to register an account with two-factor authentication, so they amped up security. So they're not competing anymore. They're not competing on ease of use completely. They're competing on security. They're competing on privacy, and they're competing on stealth, right? So stealth as in you get packages delivered with illegal narcotics that are not per se very well detectable. Whereas the other alternative, I just showed that, the Telegram channels, that's really out in the open. Everyone can see those Telegram channels. You can pay in prepaid debit cards. They're competing on customer experience. They're not competing on privacy, security, or any other thoughts that are more on a professional level. So this is the story of why Monero became the most preferred payment option on dark markets. So it's not per se the community who, and then community I mean buyers, because that is a bigger community, that decided to push for this shift. Vendors signaled they would like to push for this shift, but in the end it turned out to be the admins that are the real changing, or that was the real game changer, that they shifted to Monero completely. But then comes the question, in an anonymous environment where you normally have this escrow system, how do you do that? Because an escrow system really only works whenever you have multi-sig wallets, right? Because if you don't, the middleman, in this case the market, can just run off with all your money, right? Because if you as a buyer or a vendor have no control of who is actually keeping your funds, you might run off with, they might run off with your money. And this is still a bottleneck, as in, to my knowledge, there is no nice GUI interface that you can use to do multi-sig with Monero in a system like this. So that is still a challenge to be solved, but what these markets have been doing is pushing the boundaries of security and privacy, coming together on these types of markets. Next slide, please. So this was what I would like to tell about the work that I've been doing with some colleagues in Delft to you. And I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you. There's a question in the back. I don't know if there's a microphone somewhere. I hope that the 10 meme thing was a nice. Yeah, okay. Thanks. One person is clapping. It's nice.
So quick question for you.
Yeah.
This week, obviously, there was a huge shakeup in the darknet market world with
Yeah.
Hydra being taken down,
Yeah.
which was also really the last large Bitcoin-only
Yep.
darknet market.
Yep.
How do you see that shaking up the adoption of Monero and darknet markets overall?
I think it's a very good question, by the way. Thanks. I think that was still a bit legacy, to be fair. That market started maybe 10 years ago, so it had a really long lifespan that you normally don't see. Partly due to the fact that they were focusing on the Russian and the old Soviet state market. And actually only now, because of these sanctions in place, with the war between Ukraine and Russia going on, only now they had enough legal power to actually shut down the market. Otherwise it would have run for years, is my guess. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's not going to change. It's more like that was the odd one out still, running Bitcoin solely. And I think the default, the standard has now become Monero-only marketplaces. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
You got any Will Smith Monero memes?
Will Smith Monero memes? Oh, yeah. I was actually trying to get meme tips, but this is nice. Yeah.
I haven't seen enough.
Okay. Yeah, apparently the format is doing a talk in 10 memes. Otherwise I would have had 20, but that's sort of like, yeah, I don't know. Any other questions?
Yeah, so a question at the back.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see you.
That's okay. So you talked about darknet markets as like broad marketplaces,
Yeah.
eBay style. I'd imagine some of the vendors have got frustrated with the exits over time, whether or not it's exit scam or whether it's voluntary.
Yeah.
Has there been much of a shift towards vendors setting up their own marketplace or sites, I guess?
Yeah.
Or is that still going on?
No. Very good question. Yes, that was going on for quite a bit. The problem is, this is also about the economies of scale. So if you are a brand which is not being able to attract as many customers as you would if you would be on eBay, Amazon. This is sort of the same like your neighborhood grocery store versus a store that is connected with either eBay or Amazon that has more traction. So unless you have a very good brand by yourself and you may be in a niche, then it might be worthwhile to go that way. But then comes the other part of the equation, which is how do you secure your reputation in an anonymous setting without a third party acting as a middleman, right? So there is no marketplace. You are the vendor and the marketplace at the same time. So you can't do escrow. You can't do stuff like this, right? Because you are two parties in a three-party system. And that does not work completely, or doesn't work like it should do. So there are stores that are, what we call single vendor stores. So there's only one vendor running one store, but it's not the default. The default is still these big markets, and not per se because that's the best option, but economies of scale just make sure that that is still the most preferred solution. Yeah.
Just one quick follow-up to that. So you mentioned that a lot of these markets, or the markets that were using Monero, were not using multisig.
No.
How much of a hindrance is that in the darknet space? That
a big hindrance, but I mean, if these admins are, teaming up and are saying, now not per se teaming up because they don't know each other, I guess, but I mean like teaming up in the sense of that they're all raising the bar to a certain level and are not lowering the bar anymore. So the downside is that multisig doesn't support, so they're still running escrow, but without multisig, which is more dangerous, right? Because the marketplace then really controls the funds all completely by its own and not in a shared environment. But I guess the ecosystem is okay with that, given given the side effects of using Bitcoin. Not having multi-sig outweighs using or still pivoting back to Bitcoin.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Maybe a last question. I don't know how we are in time. Oh yeah, there's one question right there.
So I'm still pretty new to Monero, and I was just wondering, based on your talk, since this is such a common use case for Monero,
Yeah.
what do you anticipate, like law enforcement, once they catch on to Monero, like what in the future, maybe like what kind of actions legislators or policymakers could try to take to come at this particular use case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are multiple ways in which to approach this problem, if you can define it as a problem. But I think law enforcement does, of course. There's the money avenue, right? So, and that's what they did in the past, like follow the money approaches using Bitcoin. There's of course something else, which is that these technical infrastructures are not maintained by Amazon and eBay, right? They're maintained by so-called professionals, but of course they're not as professional as the Amazon or eBay tech staff, which means that they're also that they make mistakes in configuring these websites. So that's the other avenue or route of exploitation that law enforcement takes to take down these websites. So then maybe the way to use or the advantage they might have had with Bitcoin following the money around might disappear with people pivoting to Monero. But on the other hand, these technical mishaps in configuration still happen. So that means that they have still plenty of opportunities to go after these markets if they please.
But that's with the markets itself, not with actually Monero, because Monero, there's really no way that they can...
Not that I see currently right now, but I mean like from a more regulatory standpoint, of course, there are places in the ecosystem, right? So where Monero gets transacted or gets exchanged for another currency. That can be fiat currency, but it can also be another cryptocurrency. Those are places that law enforcement can, of course, try to regulate certain aspects of doing business in that area. But I mean, those are in its early stages, those regulatory options. Yeah. So I don't know if this answers your question, but
Thank you.
You're welcome. Going once, going twice. Thanks, everyone.